She had walked this path 100 times in her mind, rehearsing answers, imagining success. But the reality hit differently. The office was cold, sterile, and every look she received carried an unspoken weight. It wasn't her resume they had seen that. It wasn't her skills they had reviewed that. It was her skin. Subtle bias, unspoken but undeniable, creeping into every decision. And as the meeting ended and the door closed behind her, she felt a shock that went beyond rejection. What they didn't know, what no one could predict, was how she would turn this moment upside down. Jada had always been driven. At 22, she balanced college classes, a part-time internship, and volunteer work at the local community center. Her days were long. Each step felt purposeful, every late night and early morning bringing her closer to the future she envisioned. She dreamed of a career where her voice mattered, where her efforts could make a real difference. And this job interview was the first real opportunity to prove herself. On the morning of the interview, she dressed carefully, choosing a crisp blouse and neatly pressed slacks. Her mother had told her countless times, "Confidence is your best outfit. Wear it well." Jada smiled as she left the apartment, clutching her folder filled with portfolios and recommendation letters, proof of her hard work, years of dedication, and unwavering ambition. The office building was sleek, modern, and intimidating in its perfection. Glass doors reflected her nervous yet hopeful expression as she walked inside. Staff passed with polite nods, and the receptionist guided her to the waiting area. Everything seemed ordinary, but a subtle tension lingered in the air. Jada didn't notice the brief pause of the hiring manager's eyes as she entered, nor the way a colleague shifted slightly at the sight of her. These small, almost invisible moments would become the first hints of the challenge that awaited her. Challenge that had nothing to do with her skills, her experience, or her potential. Jada entered the interview room with a steadying breath, her portfolio clutched tightly in her hands. The manager sat behind a polished desk, his posture formal, a polite smile masking something she couldn't yet read. At first, the questions seemed standard about her experience, her goals, and her skills. She answered carefully, each word rehearsed but sincere, hoping her preparation would shine through. But as the interview progressed, subtle shifts began to unsettle her. The manager's pen hovered over his notepad longer than necessary when she mentioned her accomplishments. A colleague leaned in slightly, eyebrows raised, as though questioning whether she belonged in the room at all. Jada noticed but pushed. The unease aside, she had faced challenges before and always risen above them. Then came the question that made her stomach tighten. Not about her work, not about her experience, but about her appearance, her natural hair, the shade of her skin. The words were casual, almost harmless on the surface, yet they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Da's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary interview. The room's air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken judgment she could neither escape nor explain. She spoke politely, explaining that her skills and professionalism were what mattered, but her words seemed to fall into a void. The manager nodded, yet something in his gaze lingered, an invisible barrier that her resume and references could not cross. The colleague's faint smirk did not go unnoticed. The tension was palpable, suffocating, and with every passing moment, Jada could feel her hopes slipping like sand through her fingers. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When the manager finally leaned back and began to speak, Jada braced herself, knowing this was the moment that would define everything. The words were polite, measured, but their meaning was clear. She was not being considered, not because she lacked talent or preparation, but because of something she could not control as she walked out of the office. Portfolio under her arm, the corridor seemed colder than before. Each step echoed the weight of disappointment, humiliation, and frustration. People passed, unaware, oblivious to the storm inside her. She had faced rejection before, but never like this, never so personal, so systemic. Yet even in the sting of injustice, a spark of resolve flickered. She would not let this define her, nor would she let it pass silently. But the question remained, haunting and unyielding. What would she do next to turn this denial into something undeniable? Jada sat in the quiet of her apartment later that evening, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The rejection letter lay on the table, crisp and unfeeling. Her hands shook not from fatigue, but from the surge of emotions that had been building all day. Frustration, anger, and disbelief. She had prepared, excelled, and proven herself in every measurable way. And yet, the verdict had been the same: denied. Not for lack of talent, not for lack of effort, but for something that had nothing to do with her abilities: the color of her skin. The injustice settled in her chest like a heavy stone. Every memory of past achievements seemed overshadowed by the sting of bias. She remembered the subtle glances in the office, the unspoken assumptions, the questions that tested more than her knowledge. The realization hit like lightning. The world would not always judge her fairly. It had already made its decision before she had even spoken a word. But then, in the depth of that despair, something shifted. Anger transformed into resolve. This was not the end of her story yet, was a spark. The denial meant to diminish her ignited a fire instead. She pulled out her laptop, opened a blank document, and began to write not an apology, not a plea, but a story. Her story. Raw, honest, impossible to ignore. She detailed the interview, the subtle prejudice, the systemic walls that tried to stop her. Every word carried her truth, a message to the world that she would not be silenced. And as she typed, she realized the weight of what she held, the power to turn rejection into awareness, invisibility into recognition. Her voice, finally unleashed, had the potential to change minds, expose bias, and inspire action. The question lingered unrelenting. If one story could speak for so many, would the world finally listen? Jada's story didn't end with the rejection letter. In the weeks that followed, she shared her experience online, detailing the interview, the subtle prejudices, and the walls she had faced simply because of her skin. Her post went viral, resonating with countless others who had felt the sting of discrimination in offices, classrooms, and everyday life. Messages poured in from people who saw themselves in her words, silent witnesses who had suffered quietly, unsure how to respond. The impact was immediate and profound. Conversations started in workplaces and communities about bias, hiring practices, and the unspoken assumptions that shape lives long before qualifications are considered. Companies were forced to reflect, to audit, and to confront uncomfortable truths. This voice, once dismissed in a single office, now carried the weight of awareness and change. But the personal impact was even deeper. She had faced humiliation, rejection, and doubt, but she had also discovered her own resilience, the power to turn injustice into influence. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The experience left her stronger, determined, and more aware of the battles that countless others still face. This isn't just Jada's story. It's the story of millions whose talent is overlooked, whose potential is diminished by prejudice. It's a reminder that racial injustice doesn't always announce itself with headlines, but it leaves scars just as deep. And the question lingers for every viewer: how many more voices will be silenced before we truly see the patterns that persist? How many more talented, deserving individuals will face walls built not of merit, but of bias? The world can choose to act, to speak, to change, or it can continue turning away. The question is, which side will you stand on?